Good afternoon and welcome. I know several of you couldn't be here Sunday just because of life circumstances, and many more couldn't be here because of the situation with the air conditioning unit we were having. So, since we did not get to record Sunday, since we did this in the fellowship hall, I decided I would do this for y'all. And it's a day late, but better late than never. We've been talking about the end of the Old Testament for a while. We've covered Haggai, Nehemiah, and Ezra. I'll just give y'all a quick refresher on the timeline we're looking at here. In 536 BC, a remnant of Jewish people returned from exile, and they laid the temple foundation. 16 years later, Haggai comes and prophesies because they stopped building the temple, and so they finished building the temple, which finishes around 516 BC. And then we have a big break, and in 458 BC, we see Ezra bring a second group of Jewish people back. And a few years later, we see Nehemiah bring a group back. And around 430 BC is when the walls of Jerusalem are rebuilt. So we've covered all of these people, and there's this huge gap in the middle of the timeline. So what goes in this gap? The quick answer is the book of Esther. So just to give you a timeline of what's taking place in Esther. So about 30 years after the temple is finished being rebuilt, Xerxes becomes king of Persia. In 483 BC, we see Vashti is removed as queen of Persia, and we read about this in Esther chapter 1. She is asked to dance provocatively in the court, and she refuses. So the king has her dismissed and strips her of her titles. And he chooses to be a bachelor for a few, 3-4 years, and then he begins his search for a new queen. And this is when we're introduced to a beautiful young orphaned Jewish girl named Esther. And from this moment on, we see Esther really rise. So this morning, we're going to go through the entire book of Esther, and I have a lot of my notes over here because it's been a day or two since I've looked at them. So there will be a lot of just moving forward through it, more storytelling than reading too much. So when we begin with the rise of Esther, it really starts in chapter 2, and in verses 8 through 11. So we're introduced to Esther. We know that she's being raised by her first cousin Mordecai since her parents have passed away. And then chapter 2, beginning in verse 8. Sorry about that. So when the king's order and his edict were proclaimed, so the king's order and edict were to go round up all of the pure and beautiful young women and to bring them to them. And when many young women were gathered in Susa the citadel, which is the capital, in custody of Haggai, Esther also was taken into the king's palace and put in custody of Haggai, who had charge of the women. And the young woman pleased him and won his favor. And he quickly provided her with her cosmetics and her portion of food, and with 7 chosen young women from the king's palace, and advanced her and her young women to the best place in the harem. Esther had not made known to her people or kindred, for Mordecai had commanded her not to make it known. And every day Mordecai walked in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and what was happening to her. So we're going to leave this verse up, this slide up, and talk about it a little bit. So we see all of these beautiful, pure, which meaning they are virgins, gathered up, brought to the palace. And Esther somehow catches the attention of the guard placed in charge of them, and he gives her her food, makes sure she has her makeup, and advances her to the best place in the harem, as we see at the end of verse 9. So, what is a harem? A harem was a place where female servants were kept, but it's most associated with where concubines were kept. And for just a quick summary, a concubine is a female slave that was there for the pleasure of the king, whether that was providing entertainment or things of a sexual nature. So Esther is a young Jewish woman in a place like that, and she is advanced to the front of it. And Mordecai is coming in and checking on her and making sure that she's not telling anyone that she's a Jew. Because of obvious reasons of not everyone necessarily likes the Jewish people. So what happens next to these young women? In verse 12, now when the turn came for each young woman to go in to King Ahasuerus, which is Xerxes, after being 12 months under the regulations for the woman, since this was the regular period of their beautifying, 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 months with spices and ointments for women. When the young woman went into the king in this way, she was given whatever she desired to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening she would go in, and in the morning she would return to the second harem in the custody of Shashgaz, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the concubines. She would not go into the king again unless the king delighted in her and was summoned by name. So we see Esther and them are in a harem. Apparently they're not in the palace harem quite yet. So they go through this intense period of beautifying, which is probably more of a cultural thing than anything. Then each woman would go into the king. She went in at night. The king would ask if she wanted anything, and then the king would take her innocence from her, and then in the morning, after he was through with her, would send her not to her home, but to the king's harem, the harem in the palace, and she would stay in the harem for the rest of her life until she was called upon by the king. So, if they did not please the king well enough to become queen, these young women were going to be slaves. And even if they became queen, we know that based off what happened with Queen Vashti, the queen really didn't have much power or rights and was expected to kind of do what she was told. But in verse 15, we see Esther and what happens. So Esther, her time comes, and it says, when the turn came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his own daughter, to go into the king, she asked for nothing except what Hegai, the king's eunuch, who had charge of the women, advised. Now Esther was winning favor in the eyes of all who saw her, and when Esther was taken to King Xerxes and to his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign, the king loved Esther more than all of the women, and she won grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. So we see Esther go in, it's her turn. And we know what's happening to these young girls as they go visit the king. What's interesting is it does not say Esther was spared from the taking of her innocence. It says that she won the king's favor and that he loved her the best. But when she was taken in, she essentially lost her freedom. But she's now lost her innocence, and she has been selected to be queen. So she has a title that is pretty high up there for a woman, even though she doesn't really have many rights. But now we see something that's going to happen that's going to greatly increase her prominence in the court. And at the end of chapter 2, in those days, as Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold, became angry and sought to lay hands on King Xerxes. And this came to the knowledge of Mordecai, and he told it to Queen Esther. And Esther told the king in the name of Mordecai. When the affair was investigated and found to be so, the men were both hanged on the gallows, and it was recorded in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. So Esther becomes queen, and her cousin Mordecai works at the king's gate. So he helps guard the palace of the king. Well, he hears these two eunuchs talking about assassinating the king. And so he goes and tells Esther, and Esther tells the king on her cousin's behalf. And so the plot is stopped, and it's written about in the King's Chronicles. So the Chronicles were written so you would know who messed up and who had won favor of the king and how they were rewarded. And so Mordecai's name gets written in the King's Chronicles, so everyone knows that Mordecai is someone that saved the king and has warranted a reward, and everyone knows that Esther is the one that brought this information to the king. So is she still technically a slave of some kind? Yes. I mean, she gets to live in the palace, she gets to have servants, but in the grand scheme of things, she's there to do what she is told to do. And if she does anything besides what she's commanded, she could very well lose her title and be put right back to where the rest of the girls that did not win the king's favor were. So see Esther rising from this orphan girl to queen, not only queen, but a queen that has proven value to the king by helping save his life. But we also see the rise of another, back to yawning, we see the rise of another person in Haman, and in the beginning of chapter 3. After these things, King Xerxes promoted Haman the Agagite, son of Hammedatha, and advanced him and set his throne above all officials who were with him, and all the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage. So we see this mystery guy rising up, and he's put in a situation that we're kind of familiar with because it happened to Daniel a few generations ago. Daniel was placed second in command of the whole kingdom. Everyone was below him but the king. And we see that with Haman now. So Haman has an immense amount of authority. But it lists him as an Agagite. So what is an Agagite? Which is a fun word to say. Don't recommend saying it a lot because it is kind of difficult. An Agagite is a descendant of Esau through his son Amalek. Now, they're often called Amalekites throughout the Old Testament, and we will get to the point to where I figure out why they're called Agagites. But then they attacked the Israelites on their way out of Egypt, and Moses cursed them for destruction. So these people lived in the Sinai Peninsula. So after they crossed the Red Sea into the peninsula, these people were there and they attacked them. In Judges, they joined the Midianites and the Moabites, and they fought against Israel. And then we reach a point in 1 Samuel. In 1 Samuel chapter 15, Samuel, who's a prophet, tells Saul, who is the king at this time, "The Lord sent me to anoint you king over his people Israel. Now therefore listen to the words of the Lord. Thus says the Lord of hosts, I have noted what Amalek did to Israel in opposing them on the way when they came up out of Egypt. Now go and strike Amalek and devote to destruction all that they have. Do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. So why is this important? They lived in the Sinai Peninsula, and they were known as being semi-nomadic. So they had cities and stuff, but they traveled a lot because they would travel with their livestock. So for this command, they are killing everything. They are killing their people and their way of life. They're wiping it off the face of the earth because of the opposition they have shown God and his people. So we see Saul go out. He takes his army and he returns. And he returns with the king of the Amalekites, whose name is Agag, and with their best livestock. And God goes to Samuel and says, look, I am furious at Saul because he disobeyed me. And he goes and he confronts Saul. Said, Saul, did you kill everyone? He said, yeah, I killed everyone. I went across the entire peninsula. I wiped everyone out, except the king and the best stuff, because we want to sacrifice the best stuff to God. And so we know Saul lies to Samuel in this situation. He did not wipe everyone out. He captured the king and most likely quit and came back. So Agag dies. Saul kills him. But God removes his favor from Saul and says he regrets making Saul king. And that's when we see the rise of David. And David, when he becomes king, also fights against the Amalekites, which shows that Saul definitely lied when he told what he did to Samuel. And then in 1 Chronicles, we see that the tribe of Simeon wiped out most of the remaining Amalekites and moved into their cities. So we see a situation where the Amalekites become the Agagites. So what probably happened is there were some descendants of Agag that survived, and as they continued to war with Israel, the descendants of Agag were probably the ones that were left the most, or whenever they got wiped out by the tribe of Simeon, the tribe of Agag, or the family that came from Agag, just kind of went their own way. But these are people that are enemies of the Jewish people. And do you think that they probably grew up knowing? I'm sure they've learned what Saul was commanded to do and what Saul didn't do. I'm sure they knew that a lot of their people died at the hands of Saul and the Israelites. And so for Haman, these were probably stories that he's been told. So when he sees Mordecai not honor him, and when he finds out Mordecai is a Jew, you can probably tell where this is going to go. So Haman goes and he tells the king, there's a group of people in your kingdom that do not follow the laws of the king, that don't follow the God of the king. They're trouble, and we need to wipe them out. So back in Esther, the king says, okay, here's my signet ring. You make up the rule and you send it. So in verse 13, it says, letters were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces with instruction to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all Jews, young and old, women and children, in one day, the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. A copy of the document was to be issued as a decree in every province by proclamation to all the peoples to be ready for that day. So, looking at verse 13, to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all Jews, young and old, women and children. And then to take all of their goods as your own. Now, flashback to the command that Samuel gave Saul: kill every person and their livestock. So, I would say that Haman probably knew the history, and he probably knew what happened to King Haggai, or King Agag. So we see the Jewish people at the threat of annihilation. Why are they being annihilated? Because Saul did not do what he should have done, and these people were allowed to persist. And not only were they allowed to persist, they knew the history behind it. They knew that the Israelites were given the order to destroy them all. Now you have this one guy, and he's in a position. He is the second most powerful man in the most powerful empire, and he's given the ability to do whatever he wants. And he says, okay, the order that was given to you for us, I'm given for you, and Israel, we're coming for you. The Jewish people have the temple built in Jerusalem. They're sacrificing to God. God has restored his relationship with the people. So for them to be able to get this order and to know what's coming for them, because you have to imagine Jerusalem doesn't have any walls at this point. It's an open city. Anyone can come in that wants to. They're sitting ducks. And then you have the Jews in the capital city. How are you going to escape being murdered? And then all the rest of the Jews throughout the kingdom. This is a crisis of epic proportions for the Jewish people. And we see Mordecai, when he finds out, he grieves, he falls apart, he tears his clothes, he puts on sackcloth. Well, when he puts on sackcloth, that means he can't enter the king's gate. If he can't enter the king's gate, he kind of loses his full effectiveness at doing his job. So he's sitting on the outside. Some servants go in and tell Esther. So Esther sends out clothes and tells him to put the clothes on, and he refuses. He gives the slaves a copy of the edict that was sent out, and it goes back to Esther. When it gets to Esther, she says, well, look, what can I do? I can't go to the king. The only way I can go to the king is if he invites me. If I go unannounced, it's a death penalty on my life. And he hasn't invited me for a whole month. So the servant goes out and tells Mordecai this. And here is Mordecai's response. And they told Mordecai what Esther had said. Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. So I'm going to leave this up so we can look at it. Just really think about this. Esther's probably in her late teens at this point, and she's being charged with the salvation of the entire Jewish people. And Esther's had a hard life. She doesn't have parents. She's lost her freedom. She's in a court to where she can't even go to her husband without his permission on pain of death. So what does she do? Does she risk her own life? This is an immense amount of pressure to be placed on such a young girl. But Mordecai just puts it to her plain. Just because you're in the palace does not mean you're going to escape. Once they find out who you are, it's signed with the king's signet ring. You are going to be killed. And if you keep silent, I know that God will send someone else to defend the Jews. He's already established his relationship with us again. We're sacrificing to him at the temple. He will not let anything happen to his holy people. But me and you, your father's house, we're here. We're in the capital of Susa. We're in the palace. And we will die. And then he ends, who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. So he gives her the bleakest picture possible. He says, look, Esther, this could be the reason you're here. Everything that's happened in your life could have led you to this point. So how does such a young girl react to this situation? Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, go gather all the Jews to be found in Susa and hold a fast on my behalf. And do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my young women will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. Mordecai then went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him. So Esther, in the biggest moment of crisis she's ever faced, what was her reaction? Go fast. Get all the Jews you know to fast. So why would they fast? Well, Jewish people fasted so that they could have a more intentional time of prayer to God. If they had an urgent need, if they were suffering under immense circumstances, they would fast and they would pray and they would use that as a way to turn back to God. So Esther is one of 2 books where the name of God is never mentioned. But here we see action directly aimed at getting God's attention for help, to get them through the situation they're in, for guidance on how to get through. And then she says, look, we'll fast, we'll do this, and I'll go to the king. It's wrong, it's illegal, and it's a risk I'm going to take. And if he decides that the law applies to me, like he did with Vashti, I'll take my chances, and if I die, I die. That is some powerful stuff that we don't necessarily like to think about. You have this young girl who's had an incredibly hard life, who's had every reason to give up faith, but in the biggest crisis of her life, her immediate reaction is, let's seek God's will, let's seek God's guidance and help, and I will do what I have to do, and I will accept the consequences of that. So they all fast for 3 days and 3 nights. Then she gets dressed and approaches the king. And the king happens to be in a good mood that day. And he says, my wife, anything you ask of me, up to half of my kingdom, is yours. And Esther says, how about this? How about tomorrow night, you and Haman come to my part of the palace. I'll throw you a little meal, and then I'll tell you what I want. And the king agrees. And Haman is getting pretty arrogant at this point, and he's bragging about how many sons that he has, because he has 10 sons. He's bragging about how much power and wealth that he has, and how he's the only person besides the king that the queen invited. He's relishing in it, and then he sees Mordecai, and he becomes filled with anger. It says tomorrow morning there needs to be a gallows built, and Mordecai is going to die. We're hanging him. But that night, the king just happens to be restless, and he has the scribe or servant read the Chronicles of the Kings to him, and he realizes that when his life was saved by Mordecai, that Mordecai was never honored. So the next morning, Haman is preparing to hang Mordecai, and the king comes and says, "Look, this man saved my life, Haman. I need you to go honor him." And so Haman is disappointed. He's ashamed. He's just been embarrassed. And he goes home. And his family tells him, "Look, maybe this is a sign that this Mordecai guy, that the Jewish people, if you try to do anything to him, if you follow through, that's going to end badly for you." And Haman ignores them. And then Haman goes to dinner and with Esther and Xerxes. So the king asks Esther again, "What is your request?" In Esther 7, verse 3, then the queen Esther answered, "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it has pleased the king, let my life be granted me for my wish, and my people for my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. If we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have been silent, for our affliction is not to be compared with the loss to the king." Then King Xerxes said to Queen Esther, "Who is he, and where is he, who has dared to do this?" And Esther said, "A foe and enemy, this wicked Haman." Then Haman was terrified before the king and queen. And we see Haman beg the queen for his life. We see after this moment, in the last few chapters of Esther, the victory that this moment won for the Jewish people. We see that Haman and all 10 of his sons are hung. So think about that. Saul was told to kill all of the Amalekites, and he didn't. And here we see Esther. She could have had the sons of Haman spared, the descendants, but she didn't. The destruction curse of Moses is being played out here. Then in the city of Susa, the capital, 500 enemies of the Jewish people are killed. Then Xerxes promotes Mordecai, and Mordecai is allowed to overturn Haman's order. And not only does he overturn the order, he gives the Jewish people the ability to defend themselves throughout the kingdom. And 75,000 enemies of the Jewish people are killed. So we see this big triumphant ending for Esther. And we really don't know what happens to her after this point. We know Mordecai is placed second in command, and he's revered throughout the Jewish people of the kingdom. We know Esther and Mordecai issue the Feast of Purim, a Jewish celebration. But then we don't hear anything. We do know that about 12 to 14 years after this, her husband dies, and her stepson, the son of Vashti, comes to power. Could she have died of natural causes? Yeah, she could have lived a long, happy life. She could have been friends with her stepson. She could have been her stepson's enemy, and he had her killed. She could have been allowed to return with Nehemiah after the king's death. We don't know. There's no other mention of her. But in this moment, we know that she was willing to risk it all on faith, knowing that it was the right thing to do for her people. So how does that apply to us? So I would say that the biggest takeaway we can have is that God can work through any situation, but we must be ready to be used. When you look at Esther, when she was an orphan, God was working in that situation. When she was a slave in the harem, God was working in that situation and gave her everything she needed. When she was forced to give up her innocence to sin with the king, God was working in that situation. And when the moment came and her people's lives were at risk, God was still working in that situation. There's no way that you can look at this, at the king's moods, at Esther just being taken, at Esther somehow, for no underlying reason, finding favor with everyone that was involved in the situation. There's no other way to explain it but God. And really, there's only that one reference to God about the fasting. But it's such a big thing because in that moment, she realized that God had put her here through the words Mordecai. So she was going to seek his will and she was going to take action regardless. So let's look at a couple of verses and see how we can apply it to this situation in our life. The first is Ecclesiastes 7, verses 13 through 14. Consider the work of God, who can make straight what he has made crooked. In the day of prosperity, be joyful, and in the day of adversity, consider God has made the one as well as the other, so that man may not find out anything that will be after him. So really think about it. In that day of victory, they rejoiced. They were joyful. But Esther never really had much to be joyful about through her life. Her entire life had been adversity. Between the orphan, between the enslavement, between being placed as queen in a culture to where you were still basically a slave. Faced with the second most powerful man, besides her husband, ordering her people's annihilation at such a young age. For all of that to happen before the age of, say, 20, she had every right to just give up. She could have said, look, I'm going to do everything I can to make sure I'm not associated as a Jew, and good luck to the rest of them. But she didn't. She had no idea what was going to come after it. In fact, she even said, if I die, I die. She knew that was very well a consequence. But the good thing about God is God creates adversity and joy and prosperity. And we never really fully know the reasons why, and we never really fully know what's coming up next. But what we do know is in every situation, we can trust God, and we can be joyful, and in the day of adversity, we can be confident knowing that we can find God in that situation, and that we can know that situation is not it. There's always something else coming, and we can be confident God is going to get us there. And the last verse I want us to look at is a pretty well-known verse, and I think it applies pretty well to the situation. Philippians chapter 4, verses 13 through 14. Not that I am speaking of being in need, for I have learned in whatever situation I am to be content. I know how to be brought low, and I know how to abound. In any and every circumstance, I have learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. And while Esther obviously did not know Jesus, she did know God. Not that they're different, but that part of the Trinity had not yet fully been revealed to them. So Esther knows God. And based on how she reacted in her abundance. We can be confident that in her poorest moments and her weakest moments that she continued to have a life of faith, even through her imperfections or her situation. And that's something that we can do too. How often do we get in a poor, pitiful me mode, or we get a little bit too big for our britches? No matter what our situation is at life, the one thing we know is that anything we do in that situation for the glory of God, we will be able to do through Christ who gives us the strength to do that. For Esther, there's also some historical things going on here. Without this moment, there's the chance of Ezra and Nehemiah surviving are pretty low. Ezra's the one that went back and read the law to the people, that called them to repentance. Nehemiah's the one that went back and to build the walls around Jerusalem once again. And so without Esther, the nation of Israel at this time, or the people of Israel, I should say, would not have had the significant moments they had following her. So just looking at what we've read, whether we're in a moment of prosperity or a moment of adversity, and I can say that as of now, our nation is definitely in a moment of adversity, and we're part of that situation. We don't know what's coming. We don't. But just like Esther did not know Ezra and Nehemiah were going back. She didn't know that Jerusalem, 450 years after her life, would be where salvation was made possible for all through the sacrifice of Christ. But because of her belief and faith in God and her understanding of Him getting her through it, we get to read today so much of the Bible that she never even imagined would take place. Now, could God have done it without her? Yes. But I think it's cool that He chose an orphaned girl. Because aren't we like that in the end of things? We're all just little orphans running around. We really have no ability to do things on our own. But God loves us, and He'll put us in positions, and He will give us what we need as long as we're seeking Him and we're willing and ready to be used when those moments come. So that is Esther in a nutshell. I hope y'all got something out of it, and I look forward to seeing y'all tomorrow. If y'all choose to come to Wednesday nights, we'll be looking at Psalm chapter 2, and I'm sure everyone's looking forward for Chris's return Sunday, and I believe he will be starting the book of Malachi. So God bless, and I hope y'all have a great rest of the week.